The clinking of crystal and the roar of male laughter echoed through the oak-panelled study of the Harrington estate. Outside the heavy mahogany doors, Blythe stood perfectly still, the hallway draughts suddenly feeling like ice against her silk evening gown. She had come to offer her new husband a quiet evening, perhaps a tentative step toward companionship. Instead, the Duke's voice, sharp, aristocratic, and utterly unbothered, sliced through the heavy oak door. Love. Heavens, don't be absurd, Thomas. The girl is barely tolerable. She is nothing more than a dowry to me, a very heavy, very necessary purse attached to a rather plain dress. The raucous laughter that followed didn't break her heart. It forged into impenetrable iron. Blythe Caulfield had never harbored grand illusions about her marriage. She was the only daughter of the late Lord Richard Caulfield, a man who had built an empire not on ancestral bloodlines, but on the unforgiving decks of merchant ships and the relentless acquisition of textile mills. He had bought his barony, a fact the ancient families of England never let them forget. Yet when Atticus Rhodes, the fiercely handsome and notoriously aloof Duke of Harrington, offered for her hand, a small, foolish part of her had dared to hope. Atticus possessed the kind of striking, aristocratic beauty that commanded ballrooms, sharp jawline, piercing grey eyes, and an effortless charm that could make a woman feel as though she were the only soul in the room. Their courtship had been brief, characterized by polite walks through Hyde Park and impeccably written letters. He had been a gentleman. He had been attentive. He had been, as Blythe now realized with a chilling clarity, putting on the performance of a lifetime. Standing in the dimly lit corridor of Harrington House, the newly minted Duchess of Harrington felt the velvet box in her hand grow heavy. Inside rested a meticulously engraved silver pocket watch, a wedding gift she had planned to give him in private, a token to mark the end of their first week as husband and wife. Inside the study, Lord Thomas Ashford, Atticus's oldest confidant, chuckled, the sound accompanied by the slosh of expensive brandy. A plain dress, Atticus. I thought the gown she wore to the ceremony was quite magnificent. Though I suppose it takes a merchant's daughter to know how to wear so much lace without collapsing under the weight of it. The gown was fine. The woman inside it is adequate, Atticus replied, his tone laced with a profound boredom that stung worse than outright hatred. But let us not mince words. The Harrington coffers were running on fumes. The estate in Cornwall is practically crumbling into the sea, and my father left a ledger of debts that would make a sovereign weep. Blythe Caulfield was the most lucrative solution available. Her father's shipping fortunes will clear the debts to the Crown and keep this estate standing. Once the funds are transferred to my control next week, I can breathe again. Until then, I must continue to play the devoted, adoring husband. And what of the Duchess? Another voice chimed in, Lord William Cavendish, a man known for his vicious gambling habits. Will you tuck her away in the country while you resume your usual entertainments in London? Precisely, Atticus said, the sound of a match striking echoing sharply. The scent of sweet tobacco began to seep under the door. She will have the title she so desperately wanted, and the Cornwall estate to manage her little gardens. I shall remain here. It is a mutually beneficial arrangement, even if she is entirely unaware of the terms. Outside, Blythe didn't gasp. She didn't dissolve into a puddle of weeping misery, nor did she throw open the doors to confront them in a fit of hysterical rage. Instead, a profound, terrifying stillness washed over her. She looked down at the velvet box. The man she had married was not a savior nor a partner. He was a thief wrapped in velvet and a title. He viewed her as a transaction, a naive vessel carrying the gold he needed to salvage his ruined legacy. Slowly, Blythe turned on her heel. The rustle of her skirts was entirely masked by the laughter erupting once more from the study. She walked back down the grand corridor, her posture impeccably straight, her face a mask of porcelain calm. By the time she reached her private bedchamber, the lingering traces of the hopeful merchant's daughter were entirely gone. In her place stood the Duchess of Harrington, and she was her father's daughter through and through. Richard Caulfield had never let a bad investment ruin him. He simply restructured the terms of the deal to ensure he came out on top. Blythe sat at her mahogany vanity, staring into the mirror. She did not shed a single tear. She opened the velvet box, looked at the silver watch for a long moment, and then calmly dropped it into the roaring fireplace. She watched the flames lick at the velvet, turning the expensive fabric to ash, watching the silver begin to blacken. "You wanted a merchant's daughter, Your Grace," Blythe whispered to the empty room, her reflection illuminated by the firelight. "You are about to learn exactly how we do business." The following morning, the dining room of Harrington House was bathed in pale sunlight. Blythe sat at the far end of the impossibly long mahogany table, nursing a cup of black tea. When Atticus entered, he was a vision of aristocratic grace. He wore a sharply tailored morning coat, his hair perfectly arranged, a warm, disarming smile playing on his lips. "Good morning, my dear," he murmured, leaning down to press a soft, entirely practiced kiss to her cheek. It took every ounce of Blythe's newly forged willpower not to recoil. "Good morning, Atticus," she replied, her voice smooth and pleasantly modulated. "Did you enjoy your evening with Lord Ashford and Lord Cavendish?" Atticus took his seat, snapping his fingers lightly for a footman to pour his coffee. "I did, thank you. Merely discussing matters of the estate and the upcoming season. Dreadfully boring things, I assure you. Nothing that should trouble your pretty head." Blythe offered a serene, vacuous smile. "How considerate of you. I shall leave the heavy burdens to you then." He returned her smile, looking deeply satisfied with her submission. "Exactly so. In fact, I have an appointment with my man of business this afternoon. We are finalizing the transfer of your dowry into the Harrington Central accounts. A mere formality, of course." "Of course," Blythe agreed softly, taking a delicate sip of her tea. As soon as Atticus's carriage rattled out of the cobblestone courtyard, Blythe moved with military precision. She bypassed the drawing rooms and the gardens, heading straight for the estate's private library, a room Atticus rarely used except to smoke. She knew where the estate manager kept the current ledgers. She had observed him locking them in a lower drawer of the heavy oak desk 2 days prior. Her father had taught her lock-picking on a rainy afternoon when she was 12, claiming that a good merchant must know how to secure his goods, and conversely, how a thief might access them. It took her less than 3 minutes with a hairpin to slide the drawer open. For the next 4 hours, Blythe did not move. Her eyes, trained by years of reading manifests and shipping accounts over her father's shoulder, darted across the Harrington ledgers. The picture they painted was far worse than a few gambling debts or a crumbling manor. The Duke of Harrington was not merely poor, he was catastrophically leveraged. His late father had invested heavily and foolishly in a massive fraudulent canal scheme in South America, borrowing against the unentailed properties. But it wasn't just bank loans. There were coded entries, recurring payments to a name that sent a chill down Blythe's spine. V. Blackwood. Victor Blackwood was not a gentleman. He was one of London's most ruthless underground moneylenders, a man who dealt in extortion and violence when his debts were not paid. Atticus owed Blackwood an exorbitant sum, nearly £60,000. The dowry Blythe brought was exactly £100,000. Atticus's plan was laid bare in the messy ink of the ledgers. He intended to seize her 100,000, pay off Blackwood and the Crown to avoid debtor's prison and social ruin, and use the remaining funds to maintain his lavish lifestyle in London while exiling her to the decaying, damp walls of the Cornwall estate. "You fool," Blythe murmured to the empty room, tracing the ink with a gloved finger. "You think my father handed you a fortune with no strings attached?" Richard Caulfield had been a genius, paranoid and protective. He knew the aristocracy looked down upon him, and he knew they would look down upon his daughter. He had arranged the marriage to secure a title for Blythe, but he had structured the dowry to secure her power. Blythe carefully replaced the ledgers, locked the drawer, and smoothed her skirts. She walked out of the library and immediately summoned her personal maid. "Clara," Blythe said, her voice brisk, "send a messenger to the city immediately. I require the presence of Mr. Josiah Croft. Tell him to meet me at the Caulfield townhouse in Mayfair, not here, and have my carriage brought around." Mr. Josiah Croft was a solicitor of the old school, sharp-eyed, utterly devoid of humour, and terrifyingly brilliant. He had been Richard Caulfield's right hand for 3 decades. When Blythe arrived at her family's vacant townhouse, Croft was already waiting in the study, a massive iron-bound briefcase resting on the table. "Your Grace," Croft said, bowing deeply. "I was surprised to receive your summons so soon after the wedding." "Mr. Croft," Blythe said, stripping off her gloves and throwing them onto a chair. "The time for formalities is over. I need you to confirm the exact stipulations of the Caulfield Trust, specifically Article 7. Croft's grey eyebrows rose slightly. He opened his briefcase and produced a thick sheaf of parchment sealed with red wax. "Article 7, Your Grace, is the fail-safe. As per your late father's explicit instructions, the principal sum of the £100,000 is transferred into the Duke's name upon marriage." "But," Blythe prompted, a dangerous glint in her eyes. "But," Croft continued, a rare, thin smile appearing on his lips, "it is placed in a heavily restricted holding account at the Bank of England. The Duke may draw upon the interest generated by the capital at his leisure. However, to liquidate or withdraw from the principal sum itself, a secondary counter-signature is required." "Whose signature?" "Yours, Your Grace, and it must be witnessed by myself or another senior partner of this firm. Without your explicit written consent on each and every withdrawal, the Duke of Harrington cannot touch a single penny of the principal." Blythe let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She walked to the window, looking out over the misty streets of London. Atticus thought she was a naive, decorative purse. He was about to discover that the purse was locked in a vault, and she was the only one holding the key. "Mr. Croft," Blythe said without turning around. "The Duke believes he is completing the transfer today. How long until his bank informs him of the restriction?" Croft checked his pocket watch. "I should imagine, given his appointment was for 2 o'clock, He is receiving the rather unpleasant news at this exact moment. The weather had turned violently by the time Blythe returned to Harrington House. A fierce thunderstorm lashed against the towering windows, mimicking the atmosphere brewing within the estate's walls. She arranged herself in the central drawing room, a sprawling space adorned with faded tapestries and worn velvet furniture, the physical manifestations of the Harrington family's silent decay. She sat near the hearth, a book of poetry open on her lap, a cup of Earl Grey tea steaming on the silver tray beside her. She looked the very picture of the docile, waiting wife. At 4:15, the heavy double doors of the drawing-room were thrown open with such force that they crashed against the walls. Atticus stood in the threshold. He was entirely soaked from the rain, his impeccable coat ruined, his top hat crushed in his fist. The mask of the charming, devoted husband had been completely obliterated. His face was pale, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked as though it might shatter, and his grey eyes were dark with an explosive, panicked fury. "Leave us!" Atticus barked at the 2 footmen standing by the door. The servants practically fled, shutting the doors hastily behind them. Blythe did not flinch. She slowly marked her page, closed her book, and looked up with an expression of mild, polite inquiry. "Atticus, darling, you are drenched. Shall I ring for a towel?" Atticus crossed the room in 3 long, predatory strides, stopping just short of her chair. He loomed over her, radiating anger and the sharp scent of damp wool and fear. "What have you done?" he demanded, his voice a low, vibrating snarl that she had never heard before. "I am sure I do not know what you mean," Blythe replied, her voice remaining soft, though her eyes locked onto his unflinchingly. "Do not play the fool with me, Blythe," he shouted, throwing his ruined hat onto a nearby settee. "I went to the Bank of England today. I went to finalize the transfer of the funds into my primary accounts as we discussed, and I was informed by a miserable, snivelling little clerk that the funds are frozen, that I cannot access the principal of my own wife's dowry without your signature." "Ah," Blythe said, a serene smile touching her lips. "You must mean Article 7 of the Caulfield Trust." "Yes, my father was terribly specific about that clause." Atticus stared at her, genuine shock temporarily piercing his rage. "You knew? You knew about this stipulation and you said nothing?" "You never asked," Blythe pointed out, reasonably, taking a sip of her tea. "You spoke only of the formality of the transfer. I assumed a man of your vast aristocratic intellect would have thoroughly read the marriage settlements before signing them." Atticus's hands curled into fists at his sides. "That money belongs to me. By law, a woman's property becomes her husband's upon marriage. By common law, perhaps," Blythe corrected him, setting her teacup down with a sharp clink. "But my father did not build his empire by relying on common law. He employed the finest solicitors in London to draft a trust that circumvents it. The money is yours in name, Atticus, but its mobility is entirely governed by me. You may enjoy the 3% interest it yields annually. I believe that comes to roughly £3,000 a year, a handsome allowance for a gentleman." 3,000. Atticus practically choked on the number. He paced away from her, running a trembling hand through his wet hair. 3,000 is nothing. It barely covers the maintenance of this house and the stables. I need the principal, Blythe. I need £60,000 by the end of the month, or—" He cut himself off, realizing he was revealing too much. "Or what?" Blythe asked. Leaning forward, the docile wife act falling away, replaced by the sharp, calculating gaze of Richard Caulfield's heir. Or Victor Blackwood will send his men to break your legs. Or perhaps he will simply take the deed to the Cornwall estate, bankrupting you entirely and dragging the ancient, noble name of Harrington through the mud. Atticus froze. The colour drained completely from his face, leaving him looking sickly and hollow. He turned to stare at her, as if seeing her for the very first time. How do you know that name? Blythe stood up. Though she was a foot shorter than him, in that moment she commanded the room entirely. She smoothed the front of her skirt and walked slowly toward him. I know everything, Atticus. I know about the canal scheme in South America. I know about your father's debts, and I know about your desperate, pathetic borrowing from underground thugs to keep up appearances. I know that you planned to pay off your debts with my father's money, and then ship me off to rot in Cornwall while you and Lord Thomas Ashford paraded around London. Atticus swallowed hard, a bead of sweat mixing with the rainwater on his forehead. You eavesdropped. I survived, Blythe corrected coldly, just as my father taught me to. You stood in your study last night and told your friends that I was nothing but a dowry to you, a heavy purse attached to a plain dress. Atticus actually took a step back, the reality of his situation crashing down upon him. The woman he thought was a clueless sheep held his life, his reputation, and his physical safety entirely in her hands. Blythe, please, Atticus stammered, the arrogance bleeding out of him replaced by raw desperation. You must sign the release. Blackwood is not a man to be trifled with. He will ruin me. He will ruin us. He will ruin you, Blythe said softly, stepping into his personal space, looking up into his terrified eyes. I am perfectly secure. My personal accounts are separate, and the trust is untouchable by your creditors. I am your husband, Atticus pleaded, his voice cracking. It is your duty to aid me. Blythe laughed, a harsh, brittle sound that echoed over the thunder outside. Duty? You stripped me of my illusions of duty and partnership last night, Your Grace. You wanted a transaction. You wanted a merchant's daughter. Well, here I am. She walked back to her chair, picking up her book. I will not sign the release, Atticus, not today. Not tomorrow. Then what do you want? He whispered, entirely defeated, staring at her as if she were a monster. Blythe sat down and opened her book, not looking at him. I want you to realize exactly who holds the power in this marriage. I want you to cancel your plans for the season. You will not be remaining in London with Lord Ashford and Lord Cavendish. Tomorrow morning, you and I are departing for Cornwall, together. You are going to learn how to run an estate properly, and you are going to earn every single penny of the £3,000 allowance. And Blackwood? Atticus asked, his voice shaking. I will handle Mr. Blackwood, Blythe said, her tone absolute. Now go and change out of those wet clothes, Your Grace. You are dripping on my carpets. Atticus Rhodes, the proud, untouchable Duke of Harrington, stood in silence for a long moment. Then with a slow, defeated nod, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving his Duchess sitting by the fire, entirely in control. The journey to Cornwall was an exercise in suffocating silence. Inside the velvet-lined carriage, the air was thick with a tension so palpable it could have been cut with a silver dining knife. Atticus sat slumped in the far corner, his long legs stretched out stiffly, his gaze fixed on the passing countryside, as if he were being carted to the gallows. He had been stripped of his London comforts, torn away from his gentlemen's clubs, and separated from the sycophants who fed his ego. Opposite him, Blythe sat with perfect posture, her lap covered in a sprawling array of architectural drafts and agricultural reports. The merchant's daughter was in her element. While Atticus mourned the loss of his season in town, Blythe was busy dissecting the rotting carcass of the Harrington legacy. "Do you intend to ignore me for the entire 3-day journey, Your Grace?" Blythe finally asked, not looking up from a particularly depressing report on the estate's tin mines. Atticus's jaw tightened. "I have nothing to say to a warden. You have effectively made me a prisoner, Blythe. My friends, Lord Ashford, Lord Cavendish, will be wondering why I have abandoned them without a word." "You did leave a word," Blythe corrected calmly, dipping a quill into a portable inkwell. "You sent notes citing a sudden, passionate desire to show your new bride your ancestral home. A very romantic gesture, widely applauded by the gossips, I am sure." Atticus scoffed, a bitter sound. "Romantic, yes. Because arriving at a crumbling, drafty manor in the middle of a torrential coastal squall is the height of romance." He was not exaggerating about the state of the property. When the carriage finally crested the jagged cliffs of the Cornish coastline, Penhaligon Manor loomed through the mist like a decaying ghost. The once magnificent Elizabethan structure was covered in creeping, unchecked ivy. Several windows in the west wing were boarded up, and the stone facade was severely pitted by decades of harsh sea salt. As the carriage pulled into the circular drive, the sparse staff lined up to greet them. There were perhaps 10 servants in total, a pathetic number for an estate of this size. At their head stood Mr. Silas Grantham, the estate manager. He was a slippery-looking man with a thinning comb-over and a coat that was entirely too expensive for his station. Atticus stepped out first, ignoring the staff entirely as he stared up at his ancestral home with profound distaste. Blythe followed, her sharp eyes taking in everything, the weeds pushing through the cobblestones, the sagging roofline, and finally, Mr. Grantham's overly slick smile. "Welcome home, Your Grace," Grantham said, bowing deeply to Atticus. "And to you, Your Grace," he added, offering Blythe a slightly less respectful nod. "We were not expecting you until the summer. The west wing is entirely unheated, and the roof in the drawing-room has developed a rather unfortunate leak." "I do not care about the leak, Grantham," Atticus snapped, brushing past him. "Have a fire lit in the library and bring me whatever whiskey is left in the cellar." As Atticus disappeared into the gloom of the manor, Blythe remained on the steps. She turned her cool gaze upon the estate manager. "Mr. Grantham, is it?" "Yes, Your Grace, at your service." "Excellent. You will find my solicitor, Mr. Croft, arriving in a separate carriage tomorrow morning. You are to surrender all estate ledgers, tenant rolls, and mine yield reports to him immediately upon his arrival." Grantham's confident posture faltered. "The ledgers, Your Grace? Surely the Duke handles such matters. It is highly irregular for a lady to—" "The Duke has delegated the restructuring of the estate to me," Blythe interrupted, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly soft register. She stepped closer to the man, noticing the gold fob watch peeking from his waistcoat. "And I find it highly irregular, Mr. Grantham, that an estate claiming a net loss for 5 consecutive years employs a manager who can afford a timepiece custom-crafted by Breguet in Paris. A piece my own father considered a luxury." Grantham turned the color of old parchment. "Have the books ready." Blythe commanded, sweeping past him into the damp, echoing foyer. Within 48 hours, the true depth of the Harrington disaster was unearthed. Sitting at the head of the dining table, surrounded by piles of documents and a grim-faced Mr. Croft, Blythe presented her findings to a sullen Atticus. "He has been robbing you blind," Blythe stated, tossing a ledger across the table toward her husband. "Grantham has been underreporting the yields from the remaining tin mines by nearly 40% and pocketing the difference. He has also been taking kickbacks from the tenant farmers in exchange for lowering their official rents." Atticus stared at the numbers, his brow furrowing in confusion and rising anger. "Grantham? My father hired him. He swore the mines were simply drying up." "Your father was a fool, and you were absent," Blythe said ruthlessly. "A lethal combination for any business. I have already dismissed Grantham. Mr. Croft has threatened him with the magistrates. He will surrender the stolen funds he has hoarded in his local accounts. Or he will hang." Atticus looked at his wife, a strange mixture of humiliation and awe warring in his features. The girl he had thought a plain, uninteresting vessel for wealth was currently dismantling and rebuilding his ancestral home with the ruthless efficiency of a military general. You sacked the estate manager without consulting me?" Atticus managed to say. "I consulted the ledgers. They were quite communicative," Blythe replied, standing up and smoothing her skirts. "We have a massive undertaking ahead of us, Atticus. We must repair the roof, hire a competent staff, and reinvest in the mines. But none of that can happen until we address the wolf currently circling the property." Atticus's pale face went entirely white. "Blackwood?" "Yes," Blythe said, turning to look out the window at the crashing grey sea. "I received a missive this morning. Mr. Victor Blackwood is not a patient man. When he discovered you had left London without paying your instalment, he decided to take a trip to the coast. He will be arriving at Penhaligon Manor by nightfall." The storm that hit the Cornish coast that evening was violent, a fitting backdrop for the arrival of London's most notorious underground creditor. Victor Blackwood did not travel like a gentleman. He arrived in a heavy, reinforced carriage, accompanied by 4 men who looked more like dockside brawlers than footmen. Blackwood himself was a towering figure dressed in immaculate, severe, black tailoring that contrasted sharply with the brutal, scarred line of his jaw. He was a man who had clawed his way up from the gutters of Whitechapel through sheer violence and cunning, lending money to desperate aristocrats and holding their reputations, and often their lives, in his iron grip. Atticus was a trembling wreck. He paced the drawing-room, taking rapid gulps from a glass of cheap brandy, jumping at every crash of thunder. "I should flee," Atticus muttered frantically. "I can take a horse from the stables. I can ride to Plymouth." "And leave your wife to face your violent creditors alone?" Blythe asked, sitting by the hearth, perfectly composed, embroidering a linen handkerchief. "How very noble, Your Grace. Sit down. You are making me dizzy." When the heavy oak doors of the drawing-room swung open, Blackwood stepped in. His dark eyes instantly found Atticus, pinning the Duke in place like a butterfly on a board. "Your Grace," Blackwood said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that carried no respect whatsoever. "You are a difficult man to locate. You missed our appointment at Coutts and Company in London. I took the liberty of coming to you." Atticus opened his mouth, but no sound came out. "Mr. Blackwood," Blythe said smoothly, cutting through the heavy silence, She set her embroidery aside and stood up. "I am Blythe Rhodes, Duchess of Harrington. Please take a seat. I believe it is me you need to speak with." Blackwood's gaze shifted to Blythe. He looked her up and down, a patronizing smirk touching his lips. "With all due respect, Your Grace, I do not discuss business with wives. I am here for my £60,000, and if your husband does not produce it tonight, I will be taking the deeds to this estate and every valuable piece of art left in this crumbling ruin." "You will take nothing," Blythe said, her voice ringing out clearly, echoing against the high stone ceiling. Blackwood's smirk vanished. His eyes narrowed dangerously. "Are you threatening me, little girl?" "I am stating a legal fact," Blythe countered, stepping forward to stand between Blackwood and her trembling husband. "The deeds to Penhaligon Manor, along with the unentailed lands, were transferred into the Caulfield Trust as collateral upon my marriage to the Duke. They are heavily insured by Lloyd's of London and completely shielded from prior creditors." Blackwood glared at Atticus, who was staring at his wife in pure shock. "Is this true?" The moneylender snarled. "It is," Blythe answered for him. "My husband currently possesses nothing of value that you can legally seize. You cannot take his lands. You cannot touch his bank accounts because they are entirely empty. And you cannot touch my dowry because it is locked behind my signature." Blackwood took a menacing step toward her. "The law means very little to me, Duchess. If I do not get my money, I will break his legs, and then I will break his neck. And then you will get absolutely nothing," Blythe pointed out, utterly unfazed by his proximity. "A dead duke cannot repay a debt, Mr. Blackwood, but a living, partnered duke, well, that is a different story." Blackwood paused, tilting his head. "Partnered?" "My father, Richard Caulfield, controlled the most lucrative merchant shipping fleet in the East Indies," Blythe said, her tone shifting from defensive to predatory. "Before he died, he secured a highly restricted, exclusive trade charter with the Crown for importing raw silks and spices from Ceylon. That charter is currently sitting dormant in my trust." She walked over to the mahogany desk, picked up a thick, wax-sealed document, and held it up. "I know you are trying to legitimize your wealth, Mr. Blackwood," Blythe continued. "You are tired of operating in the shadows. You want to be a legitimate businessman in the city. I am offering you a 20% stake in the Ceylon Charter. It will guarantee you a legitimate, immense return on your investment over the next 5 years, far exceeding the £60,000 my idiot husband owes you." Blackwood stared at the document, a hungry gleam entering his dark eyes. "You would partner with a man like me?" "I am a merchant's daughter," Blythe said coldly. "I partner with whoever can guarantee my investments. But there are conditions." "Name them," Blackwood said, his tone entirely changed, recognizing a fellow predator. "First, Atticus's debt to you is forgiven entirely. The paper is burned tonight. Second, you will use your specialized men to ensure that Mr. Silas Grantham, our former estate manager, successfully transfers every stolen penny back into the Harrington accounts before he flees to France." Blackwood let out a harsh, booming laugh. It was the sound of genuine amusement. He looked at Atticus, who was still cowering near the fireplace, and then back to Blythe. "He married a sheep," Blackwood chuckled, "and found a wolf in his bed. You have a deal, Duchess. Draw up the papers." As Blythe sat down at the desk to finalize the destruction of her husband's greatest fear, Atticus Rhodes realized with terrifying clarity that he was no longer the master of his own life. His plain, wealthy bride had not just saved him, she had conquered him. The morning after Victor Blackwood's departure, the atmosphere at Penhaligon Manor shifted violently from desperate decay to ruthless industry. The storm had broken, leaving a pale, washed-out sunlight that illuminated every floor of the ancient estate. It also illuminated the new reality of Atticus Rhodes's existence. He awoke not to the gentle prodding of a valet with a silver tray of chocolate, but to the sharp, rhythmic sound of hammers. Dragging himself from his cold, damp bedchamber, Atticus found the manor swarming with local craftsmen. Masons were inspecting the pitted, sea-facing walls. Carpenters were tearing out the rotted floorboards of the west wing. And a veritable army of maids, hired from the nearby village of St. Just, were scrubbing decades of grime from the grand staircase. At the center of the chaos stood Blythe. She was dressed simply in a dark wool gown, entirely devoid of the lace and silk he had mocked in his study. Her hair was pinned back severely, and she held a leather-bound ledger in one hand and a piece of chalk in the other, directing the workmen with the commanding presence of a ship's captain. Atticus descended the stairs, feeling entirely superfluous in his own ancestral home. "What time is it?" he mumbled, rubbing his temples. The cheap brandy from the night before was enacting its revenge. "It is precisely 7:30, Your Grace," Blythe said without looking up from the figures she was chalking onto a slate for the head carpenter. "Mr. Croft has already departed for the village to secure the magistrate's warrant for Silas Grantham's arrest. I expect the stolen funds to be returned to our accounts by the end of the week." 7:30, Atticus repeated, a flare of his old arrogance rising to the surface. In London, gentlemen are barely concluding their evenings at this hour. Blythe finally turned to look at him, her gaze as cold and assessing as the Cornish sea. "We are not in London, Atticus, and from what I observed last night, you are no longer a gentleman of leisure. You are a man who narrowly avoided having his spine snapped by a Whitechapel thug. If you wish to eat anything other than gruel this winter, I suggest you make yourself useful." "Useful?" Atticus bristled, his aristocratic pride stinging. "I am the Duke of Harrington. I do not do manual labor." "No," Blythe agreed softly. "You simply leech off the labor of others until the well runs dry. If you will not lift a hammer, you will lift a pen. I have ordered a desk placed in the library beside mine. We are reviewing the tenant leases today. You will learn the names of the families who bleed into the soil to pay for your tailored coats." For the next 2 months, Penhaligon Manor became a crucible. Atticus was subjected to a punishing education. He learned that the tin mines, which he had dismissed as a lost cause, were actually rich with deep vein ore, but required modern pumping engines that Grantham had refused to purchase. He learned that the tenant farmers were starving because the previous manager had extorted them for winter wheat. Most painfully, he learned that his wife possessed a brilliant, tactical mind that eclipsed his own in every conceivable metric. The dynamic between them was cold, functional, and utterly devoid of romance. They were bound not by vows of love, but by the ironclad terms of a business partnership. Yet as the weeks wore on, a strange shift began to occur within Atticus. The soft, pampered dandy of Mayfair was being burned away. He spent his afternoons riding the estate boundaries, his face lashed by the salty wind, his hands calloused from holding the reins of a half-wild Cornish stallion. He began to sleep deeply, the gnawing anxiety of his debts entirely gone. Then, in late November, the past came calling. Atticus was in the muddy courtyard inspecting a shipment of iron piping for the mine's new steam engine, when a luxurious carriage bearing the crest of the Ashford family rattled up the drive. Out stepped Lord Thomas Ashford, looking entirely out of place in his pristine velvet coat and polished riding boots. "Atticus, my dear fellow," Ashford cried, stepping gingerly over a puddle. "By God, look at this place. And look at you. You look like a common labourer. We received word from your man of business that you had practically vanished into the earth. I came to rescue you." Atticus froze, the heavy iron pipe still in his gloved hands. He looked at his oldest friend, the man with whom he had laughed in his study while mocking the woman who had just saved his life. Suddenly, Ashford's velvet coat looked ridiculous. His polished boots looked fragile. "Rescue me, Thomas?" Atticus asked, his voice low and devoid of its usual aristocratic drawl. "Yes. The season is turning utterly dull without you. Cavendish has lost a fortune at hazard, and Lady Genevieve has been asking after you incessantly." Ashford chattered, clapping Atticus on the shoulder. "Leave this dreary place to the estate managers. Or, better yet, leave it to the merchant's daughter. She's used to counting copper pennies, isn't she? Let her play in the mud while we return to civilization." Blythe stepped out of the manor's front doors at that precise moment. She paused on the top step, having heard every word. Her face was an unreadable mask, but her eyes briefly met Atticus's before she turned to go back inside. "Wait," Atticus called out. His voice cracked like a whip across the courtyard, freezing both Blythe and Ashford. Atticus dropped the iron pipe. It landed with a heavy metallic clang that echoed against the stone walls. He slowly peeled off his mud-stained leather gloves and walked toward Ashford. "You will speak of my wife with the respect her title demands, Thomas," Atticus said, his tone dangerously quiet. "She is the Duchess of Harrington." Ashford laughed nervously, stepping back. "Come now, Atticus. It's just me. We all know the arrangement. You said it yourself. She's just a dowry, a heavy purse." "I was a fool," Atticus said, taking another step forward, backing his former friend against the carriage. "I was a weak, terrified, bankrupt boy playing at being a lord. The woman you just insulted stared down Victor Blackwood in my own drawing room while I cowered in the corner. She has rebuilt my family's legacy in 2 months, while I spent the last 10 years drinking it away with parasites like you." Ashford's face flushed a furious red. "Have you gone mad? She's infected you with her common merchant sensibilities." "Get off my land," Atticus commanded, his grey eyes blazing with a fierce, newly forged authority. "And if I ever hear you speak her name in the clubs of London, I will come back to the city specifically to ruin you. I have learned a great deal about aggressive business tactics recently. Do not test me." Ashford scrambled back into his carriage, barking at his driver to whip the horses. Atticus stood in the mud, breathing heavily as the carriage disappeared down the coastal road. When he finally turned around, Blythe was still standing on the top step. For the first time since the night of their wedding, the impenetrable armor of the merchant's daughter seemed to crack. She looked at him not as a liability, but as a man. "You defended me," Blythe said quietly as he walked up the steps. "I defended the truth," Atticus replied, meeting her gaze squarely. "I am done playing the fool, Blythe. I know I cannot undo the humiliation I subjected you to, But I'm asking you to teach me, not just to work the estate, but to truly run it. I want to be a partner worthy of the empire you are building." Blythe studied him for a long, silent moment. "The ledgers for the Ceylon shipping charter arrived this morning," she finally said, her tiny, almost imperceptible smile touching her lips. "They are immensely complicated. It will take us all night to review them. Then I suggest we order a pot of very strong coffee," Atticus replied. Winter gave way to a brilliant, tempestuous Cornish spring. The transformation of Penhaligon Manor was complete, but it paled in comparison to the transformation of the Duke and Duchess. They worked in tandem, a terrifyingly effective partnership. Blythe managed the macroeconomics, the shipping fleets, the investments, the long-term yields. Atticus took over the physical estate, the mines, the tenant relations, the local magistrates. He had become a man of substance. His shoulders were broader, his gaze sharper. He no longer required the adulation of London society. He found his pride in the roaring steam engines of his tin mines and the respect of his workers. And somewhere, amidst the ledgers, the muddy boots, and the late-night strategy sessions by the fire, a profound, undeniable passion had ignited between them. It was not the superficial courtship of drawing rooms, but a raw, hard-earned devotion forged in the crucible of their mutual survival. One evening in late May, Blythe was at her desk, rubbing her tired eyes, when Atticus walked in. He didn't sit at his own desk. Instead, he walked up behind her, gently placing his large, warm hands on her shoulders. Blythe leaned back into his touch, a sigh escaping her lips. "The latest reports from the East Indies fleet," she murmured. "Our profits have tripled. Blackwood has received his first legitimate dividend, and surprisingly, he sent a rather polite note of thanks." Atticus chuckled, leaning down to press a kiss to the crown of her head. "You civilized a monster, my dear. It is only fitting." He moved to the side of her chair, kneeling down so he was eye-level with her. He took her ink-stained hand in his. "Blythe," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "When I married you, I was blind. I looked at a diamond and saw only the price tag. I do not care about the trust anymore. I do not care about the dowry. If the crown stripped it all away tomorrow, I would consider myself the richest man in England just to have you by my side." Blythe's breath hitched. She reached out, her fingers tracing the sharp, handsome lines of his face, feeling the rough stubble along his jaw. "Atticus." Before she could answer, the heavy oak doors banged open. Clara, Blythe's maid, stood there looking panicked, holding a silver tray with a single wax-sealed letter. "Forgive me, your graces, but a king's messenger just rode in from London. He said it is of the utmost urgency." Atticus stood up, his protective instincts instantly flaring. He took the letter, broke the royal seal, and scanned the contents. His jaw clenched, the muscles ticking dangerously. "What is it?" Blythe asked, standing up. "It is Lord Reginald Hastings," Atticus spat, tossing the letter onto the desk. "He is the head of the Board of Trade, and a close associate of Thomas Ashford. Ashford has apparently been whispering in his ear. Hastings is challenging the legality of the Caulfield Trust in the House of Lords. He claims that a woman cannot legally hold an exclusive royal shipping charter, and that the transfer of your father's assets was fraudulent. They intend to seize the Ceylon charter and absorb it into the Crown's holdings." Blythe felt the blood drain from her face. "If they take the charter, we lose the leverage over Blackwood. We lose the primary funding for the estate's ongoing renovations." They will dismantle everything my father built. Because you are a woman? Atticus said, his voice vibrating with a quiet, lethal rage. And because Ashford wants to see me ruined for humiliating him. I must go to London, Blythe said immediately, reaching for her travel cloak. I will bring Mr. Croft. We will file an injunction. No, Atticus said, stepping into her path. A woman cannot speak on the floor of the House of Lords. They will not even let you in the building. Croft is a brilliant solicitor, but he is not a peer of the realm. They will crush him with bureaucracy. He reached out, cupping her face in his hands. You saved my family's legacy, Blythe. Now, it is time for me to save yours. This is a battle of bloodlines and ancient privileges. It is a game of titles, and I am the Duke of Harrington. 3 days later, Atticus Rhodes stood in the gilded, suffocatingly opulent chamber of the House of Lords. The room was packed. Word had spread that the reclusive Duke, who had vanished to the mud of Cornwall, was returning to defend a merchant's fortune. Lord Reginald Hastings stood at the dispatch box, looking incredibly smug, flanked by a grinning Thomas Ashford in the gallery. My lords, Hastings droned on, it is a matter of natural law and precedent. The Caulfield Trust is an aberration. A female cannot possess the temperament nor the legal standing to command a royal monopoly on the Ceylon trade route. The charter must revert to the Crown. Rubbish! The word cracked through the chamber like a musket shot. Atticus strode down the centre aisle, dressed not in the muddy clothes of a miner, but in the impeccable, terrifyingly sharp, formal robes of a duke. He carried the weight of a title that predated the Magna Carta, but his eyes held the ruthless, calculating fire of Richard Caulfield. The Duke of Harrington has the floor, the Lord Chancellor announced, surprised by the interruption. Atticus reached the dispatch box, staring Hastings down until the older man actually took a step back. My lords, Atticus began, his voice echoing powerfully off the ancient woodwork. Lord Hastings speaks of precedent and legal standing. He claims my wife, the Duchess of Harrington, is unfit to manage the Ceylon Charter. Let me enlighten this chamber on the matter of fitness. Atticus pulled a sheaf of papers from his coat. In the past 6 months, under the sole architectural and financial direction of my wife, the Penhaligon tin mines have increased their yield by 200%, employing 300 starving Cornishmen. She has negotiated trade deals that have enriched the Crown's tax coffers by £20,000 this quarter alone. She has successfully managed fleets navigating the Cape of Good Hope, while Lord Hastings struggles to navigate a carriage through Hyde Park without tipping it over. Laughter rippled through the chamber. Hastings flushed purple. Your Grace, this is highly irregular. What is irregular? Atticus roared, silencing the room. Is a cabal of idle, indebted men attempting to steal the rightful property of a brilliant woman simply because they are intimidated by her competence? He turned his gaze up to the gallery, locking eyes with a suddenly pale Thomas Ashford. The Caulfield Trust is legally ironclad. It was ratified by the King's own hand upon its creation. To challenge it is to challenge the Crown's own signature. Furthermore, I stand before you not just as a duke, but as a co-signatory. An attack on the Caulfield Trust is a direct attack on the House of Harrington. And I promise you, any man who attempts to seize my wife's empire will find himself facing the entirety of my family's remaining wealth and influence to see him utterly destroyed in the courts. The silence in the House of Lords was absolute. Atticus Rhodes had not just defended his wife's dowry. He had wielded his ancient aristocracy like a broadsword to shield her merchant genius. He had proven his worth. The challenge was quietly, hastily withdrawn by nightfall. When Atticus returned to Penhaligon Manor a week later, Blythe was waiting for him on the cliffs overlooking the sea. The wind whipped her dark hair around her face. Atticus climbed down from his horse, walking toward her with a purposeful, unhurried stride. "I received a telegram from Mr. Croft," Blythe said, tears shimmering in her eyes for the first time since their wedding night. "He said you terrified the entire House of Lords. He said you were magnificent." "I was merely representing my senior partner." Atticus smiled, wrapping his arms around her waist and pulling her flush against him. "The charter is safe. The estate is secure, and I am entirely, irrevocably yours." Blythe smiled, pulling his head down to press a fierce, passionate kiss to his lips. "Good," she whispered against his mouth. "Because I have just acquired a new textile mill in Manchester, and I need my husband to go and inspect the machinery." The society papers of London never quite understood the sudden transformation of the Duke of Harrington. He evolved from a debt-ridden, gambling dandy into one of the most formidable, powerful men in the House of Lords, an undisputed titan of industry. They whispered that the damp Cornish air had somehow cured his frivolous nature. They were entirely wrong. Atticus Rhodes had not been cured by the air. He had been forged by the brilliant, unforgiving fire of his Duchess. Blythe Caulfield had entered the marriage as a heavily guarded dowry, viewed as a mere transaction to save a crumbling ancient name. Instead, she brought an empire. Together they ruled the intersection of aristocratic privilege and ruthless commerce, proving that true power does not lie in the titles inherited by birth, but in the unbreakable partnerships forged in the fires of mutual respect, intellect, and hard-earned love.